On a quiet Tuesday morning, James Martin, once a well-respected employee at Coca-Cola, walked into a downtown bank. He wasn't there for a loan or to make a deposit. Instead, James, a man now weathered by health struggles and endless bills, approached the teller and calmly slid a handwritten note across the counter. It read, "This is a robbery. Please give me $1. The teller stared, dumbfounded. James showed no weapon, had no demands for large sums of cash, and appeared almost apologetic. Yet his quiet urgency seemed real. The teller complied, handing over a single dollar bill while secretly pressing the alarm. With the dollar in hand, James didn't run. Instead, he settled down on a waiting bench in the middle of the bank and waited for the police. So what had driven this ordinary, law-abiding man to commit such a bizarre act? His story is one that sheds light on the harsh realities facing countless Americans. James had worked for Coca-Cola for over 2 decades, a job he loved, one that had defined him. But when unexpected health issues struck, he found himself not only unable to work, but also facing a new crisis, the loss of his health insurance. As medical bills piled up, he'd watched his life savings trickle away until he was left with next to nothing. He couldn't pay for the medication and treatments that kept him going, and he couldn't work to earn more. His back was against the wall. Desperate, James made a decision that would confound the town. He reached out to the local newspaper before his robbery, sharing his plan. No one took him seriously at first. Who would rob a bank for a single dollar? It seemed absurd, like a strange joke. But when the police arrived and James was calmly arrested, the truth began to emerge. Once in custody, James was able to receive the medical care he needed, care that he couldn't afford as a free man. It was, in his eyes, a grim but necessary solution to his problem. For James, prison offered something freedom no longer could: shelter, meals, and access to basic health care. He had decided that he'd rather be in prison than die slowly, unaided, on the outside. The newspaper, initially skeptical, published his story, sparking a wave of reactions. Readers were outraged and heartbroken, unable to believe the circumstances that had forced a man to go to such lengths for healthcare. James's $1 robbery became a symbol, a striking reminder of the gaps in the healthcare system. James never intended to become a national symbol, but his strange act of desperation became a voice for countless others in similar situations. Sometimes, change begins with the simplest actions, even if it's a dollar bill in a bank. As James sat in his prison cell, he watched from afar as his story spread across the country. His $1 robbery hit a nerve, sparking a debate that reached the highest levels of government. News channels, social media platforms, and opinion pages dissected his case, and people everywhere began sharing stories of their own struggles with healthcare costs. Echoing James's sentiment, something had to change. Journalists flocked to interview him, and his story soon became an emblem of systemic failures. James, a man who had always preferred to work quietly behind the scenes, now found himself the unlikely face of a movement. Public figures weighed in, and rallies were held demanding reform. Hashtags like #DollarForCare and #Justice for James trended for weeks, capturing the public's frustration with a system that had forced someone to commit a crime to access medical treatment. But while the media attention had a powerful impact, James's situation didn't improve overnight. In prison, he grappled with mixed emotions. He was grateful for the medical care he now received, but the reality of being confined gnawed at him. Despite the cell walls around him, James had become a voice for a movement, and he didn't intend to waste his newfound platform. Working closely with reporters and advocates, he drafted letters to lawmakers and even authored op-eds from prison, urging reforms to prevent others from finding themselves in his position. Months went by, and in an unprecedented move, a group of attorneys stepped in to take on James's case, arguing that his crime was born out of necessity, not malice. Public support surged, and soon a petition for his release gained thousands of signatures. The public outcry eventually reached the governor's desk. After thorough consideration and understanding the broader impact of James's act, the governor took a bold step, commuting his sentence and ordering his immediate release. When James finally walked free, he was greeted by a crowd of supporters, people he'd never met, but who had been touched by his story. Though he stepped into freedom with little more than he had before, he also walked out with a renewed purpose. He became an advocate, tirelessly working alongside organizations that supported healthcare reform and sharing his story with lawmakers, at conferences, and in communities across the country. James's $1 robbery transformed his life and became a symbol for the need for healthcare access for all. It was a reminder of how, sometimes, one small action, one single dollar could spark a conversation that might just change the world. With his newfound freedom, James's life took on a purpose he had never anticipated. His story had turned him from an ordinary man into a symbol of resilience and a voice for those facing similar struggles. Invitations flooded in from universities, activist groups, and healthcare organizations eager to hear him speak about his experience. James found himself on stages he'd never imagined, sharing not only his story, but also his dream of a future where healthcare was accessible to all, regardless of income or employment status. Soon, a documentary filmmaker reached out to capture James's journey from a dedicated worker to a criminal forced to rob a bank for healthcare. The documentary, titled $1 for a Life*, chronicled his life, his health struggles, and his impact on the movement. It gained national attention, earning accolades for its raw portrayal of the very real choices many people face in a broken system. The film's popularity brought a surge of donations to non-profit organizations advocating for healthcare reform, further amplifying James's message. But James wanted to do more than share his story. He wanted to see lasting change. Together with a small group of advocates, he founded a non-profit organization called Dollars for Dignity. Its mission was simple yet powerful: to ensure that no one would ever have to resort to crime to receive medical care. The organization provided grants and resources to individuals in desperate need of healthcare assistance, acting as a safety net for those at risk of falling through the cracks. Dollars for Dignity also focused on lobbying efforts, working with policymakers to address gaps in healthcare coverage. Slowly but surely, JAMA's efforts began to bear fruit. Some states introduced new measures to expand healthcare access, and conversations about universal healthcare gained traction on the national stage. Through it all, James remained humble, knowing that his journey, though unusual, had ignited a wave of awareness he could have never anticipated. Years later, James received an invitation to the White House, where he was honored for his contributions to healthcare reform. In his speech, he spoke about the value of a single dollar, how it had once symbolized his own desperation, but how it had also sparked a movement that reshaped lives. He reminded the audience that no one should ever have to make the choice he did because healthcare, he believed, should be a right, not a privilege. As he stepped down from the podium to a standing ovation, James realized that his single act of desperation had not only restored his life, but had given him a purpose that reached far beyond himself. What began with $1 had blossomed into a legacy of change, one that would resonate for generations to come.